Okay, it's 8 o'clock. We might as well get started. I'm Ken Lee, and we're here in our first of two forums we're having with the designers of the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War series. Pretty much the last thing we're going to be doing this evening. Tomorrow we have our semifinals beginning of the short scenario tournament, and we're going to have another designers forum, I believe, at what time tomorrow? Sorry, I'm trying to remember. At 8 o'clock tomorrow, we're going to have our second designers forum. I did this intentionally so the folks on the West Coast could pick up this one, and then the folks in Europe will be around to hear the designers forum tomorrow. So joining us today are the three principal designers of the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War series. Hopefully all of you have had a chance maybe to say hello to them already because they've been hanging around the convention quite a bit. First of all, we have Joe Balkoski, who is the original designer of the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War series. Started off with Stonewall Jackson's Way back in 1994. Joe is I would say, a world famous war game designer. He has a number of other designs, and probably one of the most highest sales of any war game designer, I think, probably in the industry or close to it. We've also got Ed Beach, who is Joe's from Baltimore right now.
Yes.
Okay. And we have Ed Beach from Maryland. He's been with the system since it first came out 28 years ago with Stonewall Jackson's Way. He has won multiple World Board Game Championships in a variety of GCACW titles. Won the the play by email tournament, and most importantly, since the advent of the Stonewall's Last Battles module, he has been one of the three principal designers of the system. And finally, we have Chris Withers, who started playing only 22 years ago. He's from Rhode Island. He has 13 World Board Game Championship titles, including 11 in a row. But more importantly, he's gotten involved in the design of the Great Campaigns of the American Civil War modules probably 3 or 4 or 5 modules ago. And we're happy to have him. He's from Rhode Island. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Joe, Ed, and Chris to talk about the various modules in the systems and some of the design theories and rationale behind the different modules, why were they put out, the difference of them between them, etc. So take it away, gentlemen.
Okay, well, I think I'm going to start things off. Joe, you want to do a quick introduction though before we start diving into the PowerPoint?
No, go right ahead since you have the PowerPoint up there.
Okay, so I have broken it down into 4 different ways that we're going to look at differences between the modules. And so we'll just walk through each one of those and talk about how they give you kind of unique criteria to sort of decide which module you might want to pick up next, which one you might want to play, which ones might be appropriate for new players, which one might be appropriate for more experienced players. So the first thing that I wanted to point out was that it's very important in terms of the modules, which year you're representing from the war. So the 1861 modules are going to be very different than the 1864 modules just because of the nature of the way the campaigns played out in those different years, the way the armies were confident and experienced at doing long marches, those kind of things. And you can see that obviously when you look at the standard rules. There are sections in the standard rules like the leader activation sections or the entrenchment sections where those change over the years. But I think those do have a very, very significant difference in how the modules play out. I always looked at the 62 and the 63 campaigns as sort of the standard rule set. That's what Joe first put out. That was how I learned it. And to me, everything else was sort of a bit of a modifier or an adjustment from that. So I would recommend, I think, the 62 and the 63 campaigns as sort of the right place to start for most players. If you go back to 1861, The armies are just, I mean, it's the module that we have for that's called all green alike, and the armies are very, very green and very inexperienced. They don't march as far. The leaders cannot command as many troops, so it just ends up being sort of a slower pace, a little bit more cumbersome to move around the map. I think that's a great job of reflecting what happened during that 1861 campaign, but I don't necessarily think it's the right place for people to start. I think it's more of an interesting place to go if you want to explore that part of the history. And then what I have found is I actually, to admit that I have a favorite here, and my favorites are the campaigns from 1864 on. And it's all because of the fact that you have an entrench action that you can do during the action phase as part of your impulse. When you activate a leader, you might be activating 3 or 4 units, and you get the choice. Okay, this one may be moving. This one, maybe I'm not going to do anything with right now, but this other guy I'm going to entrench. And so how you expend the fatigues every turn is a very, very interesting decision. Do you go ahead and grab the objective and then entrench on it, but then maybe you're out of fatigues and you can't react to enemy moves? So I just feel like there's an extra layer of decision making. So the strategic depth is really enhanced by that entrench action. And so to me, if I'm going to pick one that I want to play, I'm going to head towards those 1864 and 1865 campaigns. So that's sort of what I wanted to lay out there, sort of to kick off the discussion. But I absolutely want to hear from Chris and Joe. We haven't talked about this ahead of time. I just put these slides together as discussion points. But I'd love to get their thoughts on the differences here.
Well, I'll go ahead. Is there an issue, Chris, with the screen?
Oh, the screen seems to keep flashing. Maybe it's just on my end. Never mind. Go ahead.
Yeah, it seems okay on mine. Anyway, yeah, I agree with Ed. Especially having just completed the Hood Strikes North module, which of course takes place in late 1864. I have found that to be the most intriguing in terms of challenge of play, and I do find that my favorite. Just to reinforce what Ed said, realistically, the Civil War started out essentially a Napoleonic-style conflict. And by the end of it, it's a completely different conflict. And if you don't represent that really deeply in the game, you're not going to have a successful design. And I don't remember when, it was probably when Ed and I were working on the standard rules and for the first skirmisher that we had to come up with a system by which you replicated the army's, much more likely tendency to dig in by the start of 1864. And I think that dates to skirmisher number 1 in the original standard rules. And I think it worked out really beautifully. And I'll pass on to Chris in a second, but I will say that a lot of what a lot of my experience in Civil War history is actually visiting battle sites. I'm sure it's the same for most of you. And a lot of my time has been spent in the 1864 campaign, the Overland campaign, and it is so dramatically powerful if you really know where you're going on those battlefields of the Wilderness and Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor, to see the surviving trench lines of the armies today. I mean, some of those trench lines that are hidden in the woods of the so-called Muleshoe in Spotsylvania are so fresh that it really gives you a beautiful understanding of how the war had transformed itself by 1864, and it's chilling to see that up close and personal. And I just think it's, it obviously was mandatory in the game system that you have to replicate history as effectively as possible. And I think, the changes for entrenching are the heart and soul of that change, as they were in the war as well. But there are also other fundamental changes that we'll talk about later, such as how cavalry just dramatically improves in effectiveness as the war goes on, particularly for the Union side. So anyway, I'll pass on to Chris
now. Well, yes, it's quite dramatic, the difference in all green and light, which I designed with Mike Bella some years ago. It's 1861, and the armies, as the Union comes out of DC, out of Alexandria and DC and whatnot, and drives on Manassas, how slow and ponderous they are. It's nothing like you're at maneuver, but I would hardly call it sweeping maneuver like you might get later on with Jackson and Longstreet racing along over open terrain. And then we come to 1864, 1865, Petersburg, which we're working on now. And it's interesting how, as after Cold Harbor, the Union had given up on that avenue of approach towards Richmond, and not sure how everyone's familiar with the geography, but marched and also did amphibious movements south to Petersburg, which is 15 miles or so south of Richmond, and to cut the rail lines in there. And how that campaign started out as huge maneuver, obviously switching their base from White House Landing on the Pamunkey, I think it is, northeast of Richmond, to south of Richmond and Petersburg at City Point. Initially, that campaign was this huge maneuver doing that operation, but then it quickly evolved into what trench warfare in front of Petersburg. But it's interesting in that as the Union tried to expand their trench lines west to cut the rails on the supply going into Petersburg, there was there was a lot of attrition on the trench lines, and it was obviously quite miserable for the soldiers. It was nothing like World War I, where the armies were constantly charging each other's trench lines over and getting slaughtered. Grant, at this point, the Union Army had essentially rebelled enough that they would not, and the rebels, to a certain extent, not as much, they would not charge any sort of fortified position. If the enemy had fortified overnight, basically, more than 24 hours, the troops simply wouldn't charge it, and nor would the commanders at this point even for the most part order it. So instead of battling the trench lines, the Union kept extending them, and every time they tried to extend them in various offensives to the west, the rebels would come out of their entrenchments and do these sharp counterattacks. So instead of a boring trench warfare series of battles and a game, it's actually open field maneuver, although it's not tons and tons of wide open hexes like maybe Stonewall Jackson's way of 20 miles by 20 miles. It's a smaller area, but it's still open field warfare that's going on as they try to extend their trench lines. And then we get to where we're at now at the Battle of Five Forks, and then the retreat to Appomattox, where it's this sweeping maneuver over huge parts of the map. So anyway, it's elements of Civil War there with the open field combat, but it's the beginnings of World War I too. And the cavalry, like Joe said, at that point, the Union cavalry was so strong, with Sheridan coming back with huge forces from the valley, that pretty much doomed Lee's ability to try to retreat out of Richmond and Petersburg down to the Carolinas.
Chris, do you want to explain to people what rule you're trying with the once a hex is fortified to a certain level, you cannot even attack it, that you've been using in that campaign?
So yes, and in the basic scenarios too. It's similar to Atlanta's ours, where in the Confederate forts around Atlanta, you can't attack them once they get to a certain strength of infantry entrenched in them. The same thing in Petersburg, although it's mostly redoubts there. So each side, once they get a certain, like a brigade approximately of infantry in a redoubt at entrenched to fort level in their own redoubt, you can't attack it. And they wouldn't attack it. And so here it's a guarantee. If you get 6 manpower in 1864 and it decreases in 1865, it's actually manpower plus artillery. The Union was the rebels to a lesser extent, but the Union was building redoubts during the campaign quite extensively. Started just a few weeks into it in early July. The campaign starts in mid-June, right after a little bit after Cold Harbor. And the Union built this whole extensive series of redoubts right opposite the Confederate redoubts. And so they basically can't be attacked if they have enough forces in them. And that's where that battle called the Crater happened. The Union redoubts opposite the Confederate redoubts. The Union dug a big mine under one section and blew up a rebel redoubt, but completely botched the assault.
Okay, so we're going to keep talking about Petersburg more tomorrow morning when we have our session on some of the new content that's coming out. But I want to keep us moving through differences between the modules. So I think we've covered the differences between the years pretty well. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide, which is the difference by terrain. So if you look at, for instance, the terrain on the Battle Above the Clouds map, where you have the huge Lookout Mountain and those other, escarpments and ridge lines. It's definitely the most restrictive terrain we have anywhere in the series. Compare that with Roads to Gettysburg, where you have, obviously you do have the mountain passes in Roads to Gettysburg, but once you get east of that South Mountain Ridge, there's some wide open terrain for 20, 30 miles at least. This is something that anyone who loves the series is going to love the maps and the work that Charlie Kibler has, but I just wanted to point out how different the terrain is in different areas. There's certain areas where you're progressing one river to a next, like Grant did during the Overland campaign, where he would turn Lee's flank and try to get across the next river down. The on to Richmond terrain, certainly some of the most unique, with how swampy and wet and subject to rain causing huge problems that Tidewater, Virginia area is. And then you have a campaign like the Atlantic campaign, where it's not necessarily the geography, but just the tether of the Union Army to the Western Atlantic Railroad that forces your Union Army to stay within a certain range of that supply line. So I think that's sort of my other big criteria in terms of like what module you might want to choose to play, or how you might experience a different gaming situation and experience based on sort of what map and part of our Eastern or Western theater sort of topography you might be coming up against. So again, I'm going to turn it over to Joe to add some additional thoughts here, and we can each comment on sort of maybe like which of these different types of maps they have the most fun campaigning on, or which elements of the geography here maybe have surprised people once they've seen it all mapped out. I think the maps are a great thing for us to spend time discussing.
Well, geography is really the fun element of this game system. From the very beginning, it was not only a very rewarding challenge for me to research it, but to play leading an army on a reasonably accurate map at about a mile per hex is a really fine window into Civil War command. So terrain is everything in this game. And now that we're up to so many modules, it's really kind of interesting to see the differences, as Ed said. So many subtleties, including some that he didn't mention. For example, the tendency to have much more open, or should I say, a prevalence of open, clear, and rolling hexes in Maryland and Pennsylvania means the army that has superior artillery is going to do very well in that campaign. But, Central Virginia, particularly the wilderness, you're going to have artillery not play as much of a role. Same thing onto Richmond. And, to me, I think my favorite part of the design is always the terrain, because you're opening a window into a different era and the way the country looked at that time. And it's a very rewarding look into history to see how, society operated, and then, of course, how the military operated in this type of geography. Again, I'll bring up the new game we just finished, Hood Strikes North. A bit of a unique map. Number one, it's only a single map, so that's going to be unique in the series. But it surprised me a bit how I never, as a child, was as much into the Western theater as I was into the Eastern, and of course, Tennessee was not part of the original settlements of the country. But when you looked into the topography and the road network of Nashville, heading south toward Columbia, which is the heart and soul of this campaign, it's surprising how sophisticated the road network was. Nashville was really a center of commerce before the Civil War, and the number of pikes that lead from everywhere to Nashville was pretty surprising. But on the other side of the coin, a vast swath of the western side of the map is kind of trackless wilderness. Interestingly enough, you see the original Natchez Trace, which was an original early 18th century, commercial path for the farmers in the Ohio Valley to take their goods down to New Orleans and the Mississippi. So the Natchez Trace appears on this as a typical road, not as a pike, but it was just an old-fashioned road. So in terms of what I like the best, or what's my favorite, I still go back to the fourth game in the series, Stonewall in the Valley, which is still never been updated. Hopefully we will. But mapping that and the play of operating armies in the Shenandoah Valley, particularly small armies, is really, really intriguing, because not only do you have mountain ranges dominating the flanks of the map, but you have mountain ranges going right down, smack down the middle of the valley. And of course, in reality, Jackson exploited that very profoundly, much to his advantage. So of all of the terrain in the series so far, I do find the Stonewall in the Valley kind of the most appealing to me if you get into one of the full-length campaigns of SIV. So that's pretty much it for me. I guess I'll pass on to Chris.
So back to Hood Strikes North, which hopefully everyone will get in a few months. Guess we'll talk about that tomorrow morning. But another major feature of it is the river systems and how the Confederates were basically marching from south to north. They come off on the south edge of the map and try to get to the north edge where Nashville is. And there's some major rivers in their way, especially the first river, the Duck River, is a major obstacle for them to cross. So that's an interesting feature of these maps is the river systems. Another interesting thing is, which and I didn't know really much of anything about this campaign until we started researching it in depth. But the Battle of Franklin, Tennessee, is just 10 miles or so south of Nashville. It's amazing. It was one of the most bloody battles of the Civil War. If you measure it in losses for the number of people engaged, and it completely wrecked Hood's army. Although he still advanced to Nashville afterwards, he lost. I forget the numbers, just 5 or I forget his exact numbers. It's but they had maybe 35,000 men, and he lost like 20% of them or something like that in one day. It was just in just a few hours. It was crazy. And the people, I wonder if people in Nashville know anything about the carnage that happened just 10 miles south of them, and then all the entrenchment lines of both sides that were just a few miles south of the capital in Nashville. One of these days, got to go there and see all that stuff.
Interestingly enough, the Hood Strikes North map is the only, correct me if I'm wrong, Ed, but it takes place in December. And also the late 62 and early 63 campaign of Stones River takes place in the winter, and both of those campaigns were on this same map. So as far as I know, do we ever go into a game in which we're, late December, early January? I don't think
We
so.
did. We did. There was in the skirmisher. There was a Fredericksburg module.
Oh, there was a Fredericksburg. That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, but it is pretty. Yeah, and there's a little bit of that in some of the Chattanooga siege action. That's like November, but this is definitely later in the season than typical for a full-on module like we have here. Okay, well, I want to keep this moving. Let me go to our next slide, which is going to talk about yet another difference between the modules. And this is specifically talking about the advanced game and the campaign game. I mean, we're going to get to basic game scenarios in a second with our final slide. But there is a tremendous difference between some of the shorter campaigns, and I guess Hood Strikes North that we're talking about is definitely in this middle category where we have the quicker campaigns like Stonewall's Last Battle as well, where they may only take place over a couple of weeks. Definitely the All Green Alike campaign is pretty short as well. And then we have some tremendously long campaigns, and the New Petersburg campaign is going to be in that On to Richmond, Stonewall in the Valley, Atlanta is ours category, where we need something like a passive mode or a lull mechanism to try to get the right tempo for the campaign so that you have periods of activity followed by periods of regrouping and the army's getting resupplied and resting and getting ready for some more active campaign activity. And then finally down at the bottom, we have sort of another category of campaigns I sort of feel like are in the middle in length, where they are pretty lengthy. They're probably a month or more in length, but they're not so long that we needed to put in a passive mode or a lull type of system for them. So what I liked about this is, in terms of sort of laying out all the different modules that have come out for the series, it's very evenly divided between the shorter campaigns, the really lengthy campaigns, and then the ones in the middle. And so, I definitely think in terms of, we on the first slide, we were talking about like, where's the best place to start? And I was saying the 62, 63 rules are probably the simplest to start with. I also think that, in terms of campaigns, definitely don't start yourself out with something like the Atlanta campaign. That's just really long and has very detailed supply rules and mechanisms for supply and passive modes and so forth. So you can definitely, it's great that we have the shorter length ones, because then you can dive in and start playing campaigns without having to, invest as much time getting up to speed on it, and just invest as much time playing through it as well. So again, I'll turn it over to Joe first and then to Chris, and you guys can comment on sort of some of the factors you see that differentiate our different advanced games, and which things people might want to take into consideration as they're trying to choose what to play or what they want to spend their time with.
Okay. I'll begin again by touching on Hood Strikes North, which Ed correctly put in the middle category. It's for a campaign. It's very quick. not only is it quick, but it has essentially a lull in it, but it's not a player-induced lull. It's a weather-induced lull because in the actual campaign, I don't remember the date, Chris, but it was somewhere around December 5th or 6th. A tremendous blizzard blew into Nashville, and it essentially paralyzed operations for over a week. It's said that the temperature in Fahrenheit actually dropped below zero, which is really hard to believe for Nashville in early December, but it is true. So even though that game is quick, you have a weather-induced lull in which that period flies by really quickly. Another reason why Hood Strikes North is a great, great game to get into if you're a beginner, because not only does it have only one map, it has very few units. The campaign just moves really quickly. It's helped along by this winter weather. But, of course, as Ed mentioned, the challenge of having to define in game terms what a quote-unquote lull is driven by history. And, of course, history points out that a lot of what we call lulls were driven by, maybe I'm using too strong a word, but incompetence on the part of senior commanders. I mean, let's face it, if Grant had been running the Peninsula campaign in 1862, there probably would have been no need for lulls in the game. But because McClellan was in command, I'm getting some feedback. So anyway, because McClellan was in command, and the constant delays, particularly very early in the Peninsula campaign. I mean, how long did he spend in front of the Warwick line? It was almost a month. So these are huge challenges in terms of game design. And the same thing in Petersburg, as Chris, I'm sure, is about to tell you. And I'll touch on this several times. I already have. That a game has to replicate history reasonably well for people to be satisfied with it. If you get dramatically different results than history, they think that something is wrong, and it probably is. So, it's coming up with ways by which the campaigns purposefully don't move ahead as fast as you think is a real challenge, but I really think we've handled it very well. And I guess you'll hear now from Chris about how you deal with the campaign at Petersburg that actually began in June of 64, and it doesn't really end until April of 65. And all of this is one, module. It's part of the On to Richmond reprint, but it's a standalone module. So you have to cover 10 months of action. So I'll pass it on to Chris.
And so one key aspect of that is, we have to come up with rule systems that not only model history, but also aren't cumbersome to read and understand, where you're scratching you got to keep rereading the rule every time you get every end of every turn or any cycle or something like that. So it's not so complex. We don't want to burden the player with stuff. You want to move your units around and fight battles and stuff like that. You don't want to keep referring to rule systems. So that's what we're coming up with. Petersburg and now is coming up with a lull passive system and a lull system to move the game along in these periods. Basically, in the beginning of the campaign, started about mid-June 1864. There was an offensive by Grant approximately every 2 weeks, although sometimes it varied. It was an extremely hot summer, so in some cases he would wait a month. And it was about a 10-month campaign, although it's got December, January, February, the winter months, and November is obviously somewhat cold, and March is somewhat cool and rainy, not as much action. So there's it's interesting they refer to Petersburg, and when you start looking at the sources and whatnot, as offensives. Like they had his first offensive, the second offensive, and they basically number them, although there gets to be a little controversy on how many there were. But there was approximately 9 or so offensives over a 10-month period. So if you pull out the winter months where there was one, and there wasn't much in November or March, you come up with about one every couple of weeks or so. So we are coming up with a system to model that looks like it'll work pretty well, and we'll find out in playtest. We'll start playtesting it, and we'll have to start tweaking it and see what works. But yeah, we have a design philosophy of, I always call it a KISS from my engineer days: keep it simple, stupid. Don't if you can find a reason to keep a rule out, do it. Don't try and get so clever and keep writing rules that aren't really necessary.
Yeah, I would add to that. I've been. Go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead.
I just wanted to add that I've been reading a lot about Vicksburg in the past couple of months, and again, it's no accident that Grant is the man in charge of that campaign, but just so dramatic how he changed the Civil War. You're not going to need any lulls there. But the day he crossed from the west side of the Mississippi to the east side of the Mississippi, only 18 days were expended between that landing on the Mississippi and the point at which Vicksburg was, besieged. And essentially, he had no supply line. So, a lot of these games are driven by who actually was in command and how dramatic and aggressive that commander was.
And also who the enemy commander was. It'd be interesting to see how different Vicksburg would have turned out if Lee had been in command of the Confederates instead. That's one of the things that I think probably always slowed Grant down in the wilderness and at Petersburg was he was facing Lee.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, good discussion. So let's go and look at our final slide. I think we can talk about that for about 10 minutes, and then we might have a few minutes at the end for some questions. But the last way that I wanted us to look at differences between the modules, and this is almost sort of differences between the scenarios within the module. It's not necessarily quite at the module level. But I wanted to look at the different scenario types that we have. And we try to set up each of our games in the series so that there's a nice variety of basic game scenarios for everyone to play. We like to have some of those short one-day introductory scenarios or scenarios to play if you only have an hour or two. We like to have some of the longer 4 or 5 day scenarios where being able to sort of pace your advance and keep your troops fresh for the final push towards the end of the scenario, that's important. And you have to think you're not quite playing a campaign game, but you have some of those multi-day considerations. We like to also have scenarios that are built around lots and lots of maneuver, and it's all about which roads you're going to take, whether you can get the jump on your enemy and get maneuvering faster than they can. We also have scenarios that are much more like pitch battles, where we might have 5 or 6 objective hexes clumped around the center of the center of the map, like maybe the wilderness battle, or when you play Battle for Atlanta or Gettysburg, you get that same kind of thing where it's like a pitch battle for fixed objectives. And then I've been playtesting some of the Petersburg and On to Richmond 2 content. Fresh in my mind is the idea of a retreat scenario. Right now we're testing retreat to Appomattox, where the lines have crumbled at Petersburg, and Lee has to try to extricate his army. Hopefully, if he does it well, he can get onto the rail line headed down towards North Carolina and regroup down in the Danville area. So we have added extra map that we'll be showing you tomorrow morning. And the retreat scenario is sort of a mad dash to try to save the Army of Northern Virginia and not let Sheridan and the rest of Grant's forces pin you down and stop you from being able to fight later. But we also have other retreat scenarios in the game. There's a Roads to Gettysburg scenario that's the retreat back to the Potomac. You have Johnston's retreat up the peninsula. So that's definitely a type of scenario that we have put into a lot of the different modules. So I definitely, there might even be more types than this. Those are sort of the four main ones that jumped out at me. But I felt like that's after you sort of pick which module you want to play based on how complex the rules are, what terrain you like to fight on. Then sort of the next thing you need to think about is within that module, what scenario specifically do you want to choose? And so thinking about which of these categories that it falls into, I think is sort of the next thing that you want to look at.
Well, again, I'll begin my talk by bringing up Hood Strikes North, because all four of these scenario types are done in the Nashville campaign, and they're really interesting because of some of the figures involved. The maneuver scenario with infantry is really how the campaign opens. Hood really pulled a fast one on Schofield by moving very quickly from northern Alabama into southern Tennessee, and I forget which scenario it is. It's the second and or the third in the game, but Hood pulls off a Jacksonian flanking maneuver with infantry that's brilliant. Unfortunately, his execution, which resulted in the so-called Battle of Spring Hill, was more Burnside-like than Jackson. So, and that inevitably led to Franklin the next day. So, you also have cavalry scenarios in Hood Strikes North, and what better cavalry leader do you have in this game series than Nathan Bedford Forrest? And he is somebody you really learn to fear as the northern player in this game. There are two scenarios involving him heavily and his cavalry pretty much alone. One, as he comes on the map, and two, a very, very little known campaign known as the Second Battle of Murfreesboro, where with all his cavalry and one infantry division sent over from Hood in early December of '64, he tried to capture Murfreesboro and failed. So we have a scenario on that, and of course we have one of the most famous pitched battles of the Civil War, Nashville, which you might say was probably, in terms of pure decisive victory, that might have been one of the most decisive victory of the Civil War in terms of how it crushed the opposing army. And then, a retreat scenario where Hood pulls back into off the map, heading back to Alabama. So it's all in there. And in terms of my favorites, I guess I always preferred the maneuver scenarios. I think, the game system works really well when you combine how units operate with the map and the unique road networks of each game. I think that keeps things interesting. Pre-Vassal, I used to have trouble with the pitch battles because of the high stacks of units. That problem has pretty much now been solved by Vassal, so you have to go back and take a look at those pitch battle scenarios again. Retreat scenarios always struck me as difficult because they're very hard to replicate in terms of history. And indeed, it seems to me, if my memory is correct, the idea that has cropped up in special rules now and then for an army leader activation really came to me when you look at Lee's army after Gettysburg. Late on the 4th and on July 5th, he just walked away from Meade with a 17-mile wagon train. Now, true, the Union cavalry pursued the wagon train, But basically, Lee's entire army walked away from Meade with virtually no interference. And, in the game, that's very, very unlikely that that's going to happen that way. So that's when I don't remember whether we did anything in that game about that, but that's a special rule that for army activation to replicate history and army leader activation that would address it. If you've ever tried to pull back an army from a pursuing army, the initiatives are so key. It's one of the trickiest maneuvers in the game series, trying to do a successful retreat. It's by far the most challenging thing. So I'll leave it at that and pass it on to Chris.
Right, and so in that retreat scenario, and also Johnson's retreat, or the other way around it is we just give the retreating side 2 early initiatives. Usually it's 2, and same thing we're doing in a retreat to Appomattox. We give the Confederates 2 initiatives to open it up because they basically got going first. Although the Army retreat wouldn't work quite as well there because the Rebel Army was spread out north and south of the Appomattox River. But yeah, looking at this list of scenarios, it's going, oh, I like that one. I like that type. I like that. I like all those types. Maybe a little less so the pitch battles, but because I do tend to like the maneuver ones better. But it's I guess I might add to it beginners, 1-day scenarios, which maybe, although they could fall into any of those categories. An interesting tactic I learned long ago, and it works for campaigns and maneuver and retreat scenarios. In campaigns, is go for road junctions. If you don't know what you're doing, if you don't know where to move, always take a road junction, even if it means maybe holding up a hex. If you're advancing, or maybe if you're retreating, control road junctions. And which in a campaign where you're not necessarily fighting over a fixed objective, like, oh, I got to take Gettysburg sometime in the next couple turns, and that's how I win. If your victory points are calculated in some different manner than a fixed objective, you're advancing or retreating from the enemy, it's always go for a road junction. So it really brings the maps into play and how the key road networks really feature into it. So the Petersburg does not have, I would say it probably doesn't have a maneuver scenario. It's got all the other 3. It's got cavalry scenario. It's got a lot of pitched battles, and it's got a retreat scenario, but it doesn't have the maneuver one.
You wouldn't call some of the opening, like Grant's initial thrust over the James, where Petersburg was open for him. Wouldn't that be a maneuver scenario with infantry?
Yeah, I was thinking of that one is the first scenario. It's a 2 or 3 day scenario. It's a bit of a maneuver one, more so for the Union, but yes, it is a bit of a maneuver one. Not quite as sweeping as some of the other games, but and there's actually the big maneuver going on in those scenarios. Some of the longer ones, like the Crater, the 5th Offensive, and the 4th Offensive. Those are battles before and after the Crater. One, a few weeks before and a few weeks after. Is the Union was doing quite a bit of night marching. They were Grant was stealing a march on Lee repeatedly. On multiple offensives throughout the campaign, and so he would night march several, usually several 2 infantry corps and sometimes a couple cavalry divisions, unbeknownst to Lee, and march him from Petersburg to Richmond front, or vice versa, to overwhelm Lee on the other front, and try and extend that front there. So that's where a lot of the maneuver in Petersburg comes in, is doing those night marches, especially in the campaign, and then in the basic games, you're presented with opening of each of those kinds of battles is after the night march. But you often, in some of them, he did another night. He would night march to open the battle, moving from Petersburg to Richmond. And when they got stymied there, when the Confederates did basically also a lot of maneuver to get their forces from Petersburg up to Richmond and stop the Union, Grant would night march his guys right back to the Petersburg front and try to wallop the Rebs there to extend the entrenchment lines to the west. And Lee would pull forces back. So it was a lot of back and forth movements. Although the Confederates so Grant would steal a march on them, but Lee had interior lines. So it's interesting how that kind of used his interior lines to stymie the night marches somewhat.
Okay, so I think we finished going through all of our different types of modules and the difference between them. Ken, I noticed you popped back in here. Are we supposed to run about 10 more minutes? Can we take a few questions?
Oh, absolutely. I pop back up because I have a question, and then we'll open up to the rest of the group. Joe
Is there a good
mentioned.
way to? Is there a good way for people to signal that they have a question? Maybe turn on video and then we can recognize them, or
Might not be a bad. The other way you can do it, we have a chat room called Session Questions. If you want to post one there, that'd be fine, or just let people just chime in. So
okay, why don't
Is there a
people?
way do people unmute? Can people unmute
they
to
can
ask a
unmute and
question or
ask their
no?
question. Yeah, they would need to do that. So
Yeah.
we've done this. It hasn't worked too badly. Just people just blurting them out. But the question I have is, Joe, and you've all mentioned the importance of especially the Union generals and the difference in the Union generals throughout the world between McClellan. You mentioned that the Peninsula Campaign would not have been the same if Grant were in charge of the Peninsula Campaign. Can you let us know how you tried to reflect the differences in overall Army commanders in the design of the games?
I'll give a quick answer, then pass on to Ed and Chris. I mean, you note that in the game, the Army leader counter actually is not as important as the Corps leader counters. It comes into play pretty much strictly in Grand Assault. So, I guess realistically, we're putting the player in charge of, being McClellan and giving him some, restrictions that's, tell him that he can't be Grant, but he can be McClellan, but he can be his own personal version of McClellan. And clearly, when you play on to Richmond, no Union commander is going to want to replicate exactly what McClellan did. You're going to want to move faster than that. So I don't know how to answer that question other than, again, coming back to that adage that, you have these two key game design goals, and one of them is that nobody will accept the game if it doesn't bear any resemblance to reality. And secondly, nobody will accept the game if it's no fun. And that's the challenge. You have to put those things together. And when you have George McClellan as an Army leader, there are challenges on both of those game design fronts. But we want to leave it in charge of the player, though, because that's what's fun. So I'll let Ed and Chris comment.
I think the one thing I want to say about that as well is there's a lot that goes into evaluating how effective the armies are in each of the campaigns. And one metric I like to use is sort of how many actions it takes to move everybody in an army one time. So if you look at, for instance, Gettysburg, Lee only has 3 corps commanders. He can move his entire army with 3 initiatives. Everyone in his army can take a move somewhere, maybe not the cavalry, but all the infantry can. Whereas if you look on the Union side, they're split up into 7 corps at least. So it's going to take the Union commander 7 initiatives to move all of his forces one time. So I think that's not only when you're looking at how to portray the command effectiveness of an army there, you have to look not only at what you're doing with the rules that might burden the army commander, how well he's going to be able to make assaults and those kind of things, but also just what tempo that army can move at and how many activations you're going to need. I remember very clearly that Joe pointed that out to me when we were working on to Richmond together. And that's the reason that we put in the rule for that campaign, that there's a very special, unique rule in terms of how effective the Union Corps commanders are. Because we had the Confederates divided up by demi division, there was just a number of different Confederate commanders under Johnston and then Lee during that campaign. And the Union was organized, into very tight, like 3-4 corps was the whole Union Army. And so the first time we started playtesting that campaign, we were like, this Union Army is great. We can move this thing, around. It can get around the map. We're gonna, push the Confederates back to Richmond in no time at all. And we realized it was that principle of just how many actions it took to move the entire army was why that Union Army was so powerful. So there's a lot that goes into trying to come up with exactly the best way to portray the effectiveness of the commanders, and it's not just the Army commander that's a element of that.
That pretty much explains it all. One interesting little tidbit is in Hood Strikes North, we replaced the Army commander possibly during the game. I think it's a random event because we don't have strategic events. So depending on how well the Union is doing or not doing, they may Thomas might get replaced during the game, which would not be. It's basically not good for the Union. It's not any big disaster, but it's not good for them because his replacement isn't quite as good in command value. And at that point where it might happen, the Union's basically if they're still in the game, they haven't lost at Nashville. They're counterattacking the Confederates, and so they having a decent command value for your army leader is helpful. It's interesting during playtest how sometimes the exact same events would happen just like they did historically at the same time. So it made it very rewarding sometimes in playtest, even if you were on the losing end of some sort of event like that.
Yeah. So do we have any other questions from the group here? Just unmute your mic and speak up. See if we have anything in the session questions.
And keep in mind, we'll be discussing all these new modules we've been talking about in much greater detail tomorrow morning. So if you can attend that session, you'll get to see maps and have all sorts of details spilled about those modules then.
Okay. I really want to thank Joe and Chris and Ed for coming out tonight and talking to us all. I think it's been incredibly informative, and we look forward to hearing you back tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock in the morning. So set your alarm clocks, get up early, and hopefully we'll have some of our European contingents on that call. So thanks so much, guys, and see you at the rest of the convention.
Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.